Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Markets and Morality, the show which delves into the right of British politics and policy and highlights diversity of opinion. I'm Emma Revell, Head of Public Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and in this episode, I'll be asking, are we spending too much on foreign aid? Always a hot topic, cuts to foreign aid always poll well with the public, and stories of wasteful spending are rife, but all the major political parties committed to maintaining the 0.7% spending target in their 2019 general election manifestos, and supporters make a strong moral case, as well as arguing aid can be spent in ways that support Britain's self-interest. Here to discuss the issue with me today is Duncan Simpson, Research Director at the Taxpayers Alliance, and Sam Bowman, who's Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics and a Senior Fellow of the Adam Smith Institute. Thank you very much for joining me, both of you. As this show is about showcasing diversity of opinion amongst thinkers, activists, and academics who all often get lumped together as the right of British politics, can we just kick off quickly by, in your own words, just describing your personal politics and your approach to policy? Duncan, then Sam.
Well, I suppose a lot of my politics is motivated by a pretty heavy disdain, or at least suspicion, of the taxpayer-funded institutions of this country, which happily aligns with my professional interests. So, I suppose a lot of my politics sort of flows from that, really. I mean, I'm not, I don't feel loyal to any particular political party. So I suppose in summary, I'm opposed to more things than I am pro. So the anger is always bubbling away from that.
Sam?
Well, I call myself a neoliberal, by which I mean I'm somebody who thinks that any institution is justified if it's the one that makes people as happy and as free and as prosperous as possible. And I happen to think that free markets tend to be the best way of doing that. But the way I've kind of summarized it is a neoliberal is somebody who thinks that markets are astonishingly good at creating wealth, but not always perfect at distributing wealth. So I want as free an economy as possible, but I'm also pretty happy with a fairly redistributive state after all that, in as kind of light touch way as possible. So, cash transfers with a very, very simple kind of flat tax system.
Fair enough. We're recording this episode in the middle of a week where the government is at the minute tackling a brewing rebellion against the decision to cut the UK's aid budget, previously set at 0.7% of gross national income. They've decided to bring it down to 0.5%. The government's argument is that at a time of economic shock from the pandemic, we need to reprioritise. Duncan, do you think that's the right decision?
I do. And I think the position of many of the so-called rebels on the Conservative benches just sort of flies in the face of the reality which the UK is currently facing. I mean, the borrowing figures which were out at the end of May show that last financial year, which concluded at the end of March, I think we borrowed just over £300 billion. Public sector net debt is now exceeding 2.2 trillion. Now you can say that the rate of interest which we're currently paying on the debt stock in the UK is basically manageable. The UK government does indeed have an excellent record for meeting its repayments to creditors and all borrowers. All of that can be true, but again, look at the broader picture. I mean, the Bank of England, I think the asset purchase facility, so quantitative easing, printing money, I think that's now approaching £900 billion. I think there's a very niche part of the Bank of England. It's the Ways and Means facility, which is sort of a further borrowing facility of the UK government. The bank was also extended in, I think, April last year. So the economic picture is pretty grim. And I think looking at it in the round, it is still the case that the UK is incredibly generous, both in absolute terms as well as in relative terms, whether using GNI or another metric. I think compared to all other OECD countries, rather, last year at the 0.7% rate, I think the UK was the third most generous in absolute terms. So a pretty small cut from a very substantial outgoing is perfectly reasonable within the current economic circumstances, and it. I think they're sort of slightly misread some of the circumstances. If you look at the actual legislation, the 0.7% Act, that stipulates very clearly that the government is not necessarily bound legally to meet that 0.7% target if certain conditions are met, and they're very, very clear in those conditions. One of which is the fiscal circumstances in the country have changed. Tick. Second one is the economic circumstances in the UK have changed, specifically a decline in gross national income. That is a condition which is also met. And the third is that generally circumstances arising outside of the UK have also precipitated a change in the application of the overseas development assistance rather. And again, that condition has been met. So I think the government is well within their rights to have a limitation of ODA this year and in future years. Frankly, I think they should be going further rather than just buying off some of these rebels and saying, well, actually, this is a time-limited option. So yeah, good for the government. They should absolutely be doing this.
Sam, what do you think?
Well, I consider myself to be an aid skeptic, by which I mean I don't think you can use aid to make a country rich. And all of the critiques of the really great aid skeptics, the greatest in my mind being P.T. Bauer, also people like William Easterly, have been this really key point that building hydroelectric dams and building expensive infrastructure projects in the developing world is often, if not always, going to cause more harm than good. Possibly because the money is wasted. You don't know what these places need. Building a huge hydroelectric dam might not be very useful for places with really underdeveloped economies, or more likely because of corruption, meaning that the governments that you're having to deal with to do these things are going to siphon off huge amounts of money for themselves and become more predatory towards their own people. But as an aid skeptic, I oppose these cuts because I think that modern aid as the UK spends it is a triumph of aid skeptics like P.T. Bauer. Instead of focusing on things like development and economic growth, and development is a bit of a misnomer when it comes to this kind of aid, most of the money that we spend focuses on things like health, vaccinations for children, eradicating polio, food aid, clean water, and other kind of humanitarian interventions. To give an example, between 2015 and 2017, we immunized 56 million children in the developing world, which is estimated to have saved 990,000 lives, nearly 1 million children in 2 years. That represents, to me, amazingly good value for money. And because we're not doing it through governments, we're bypassing, most of the time, the governments of the day. We're avoiding the really crucial problem that all of these aid skeptics, including myself, highlighted for many, many years. So I think as a triumph of aid skeptics and as a triumph of kind of the economists' critique of development aid, we should be really impressed that UK aid has moved away from that old broken model to one that is much more bottom up and much more, I think, pragmatic and focused on making people's lives better and preventing children from dying of diseases that nobody would ever imagine their child could die of in a rich country like ours. And as well as being bottom up and focused on things like health, our aid is remarkably transparent. You can go onto the development tracker website, you can look at pretty much everything that we spend money on, and you can look at the robust independent critiques that are done of the aid projects. So the Department for International Development, as it was unbelievably transparent in terms of publishing what it does and in terms of getting independent third parties to review its projects. And you can read the reviews. Some of them are scathing, and some of the about 20% last time I checked basically said about 20% of the projects reviewed were, these aren't working, we need to get rid of them. And of course, in any government project, in any government department, there's a lot of waste. And it's important, that's why we need groups like the Taxpayers Alliance and groups like the IEA to highlight those examples of waste and to highlight the times that we're not spending the money wisely. But my message is, and the reason that I think that these aid cuts are bad, is that there is a baby and there is bathwater. The baby is the child that we're saving from dying of a disease like polio or becoming permanently disabled. The bathwater is the waste. The baby represents, in my mind, and I think that everybody can look at the aid money and how it's spent to see this, the vast majority of the money that we're spending. We're talking about millions of lives being saved and millions of children being prevented from being disabled for their whole lives. And the bathwater is some of the waste. And my fear is that we are throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you don't mind me torturing that example. And just to give an example, the cuts that we're putting forward, the cuts that are coming through, involve a 90% cut to our neglected tropical diseases fund, which seems not even very smart from a self-interested point of view, given the year we've just had. A 95% cut to polio eradication, and an 80% cut to clean water projects. To me, this seems like a very, very, very misguided place to cut spending. I would be against aid if it did more harm than good. I used to be against aid because I believed it did more harm than good. But I think that people like me, people like the IEA, people like the TPA have done such a good job at critiquing and changing the way aid works that aid has changed, aid has moved on, and if you're interested in avoiding millions of children being permanently disabled for their whole lives, this is one of the best bang for buck spending the government could possibly do. So that's why, as an aid skeptic, I think it's a bad idea to cut this spending.
I mean, you've mentioned there that, you know, some departments are incredibly transparent, and that we organizations like the IEA and TPA do a great job of highlighting some of the misspend. I mean, an IEA report in 2019 called Nanny State on Toll found that millions of pounds of taxpayers' money was being spent on, as you say, because a lot of our focus is on health, these were being spent on lifestyle interventions. So things like £1 million spent on tightening tobacco control in Colombia, nearly £7 million on a research unit in China to reduce the amount of salt in housewives' home cooking. Stories like that, as you say, Sam, are a small percentage, but they're inevitably very, very damaging to the public's perception of foreign aid. Do you think then it's much more about how we spend the money and less about how much we spend?
Well, I think, first of all, it's, I was really happy at seeing that report, because I really hate when aid money is, I mean, that's £1 million that we could have spent on inoculating children against an easily preventable disease, or on mosquito nets, or on, all these great things that we spend money on. So I think it's absolutely vital that groups like the IEA and the TPA continue to highlight that kind of waste. But at the same time, we need to put that in context. We spent, I think, something around £14.5 billion in the year that you're talking about, and the waste that your report identified was in the order of a few £1 million, so kind of a fraction of a percent of the total spent. That isn't to say that we should be relaxed about it, but it is to say that we shouldn't condemn the 14.5 billion because of 4 to 5 million or 4 to 6 million pounds of that spending. By way of analogy, the UK vaccination program in the UK against COVID has involved quite a bit of waste. When you defrost Pfizer vaccines, you have a certain time period in which you can put them into arms, and inevitably sometimes you throw those out. It would be very, very silly for us to say that the vaccine program was a bad idea because we were wasting some of the vaccines involved in that. Even when we come to things like police, which almost everybody, I think, agrees the government has a role in providing, we can definitely find examples of waste by the police. The TPA does a great job of highlighting examples of police forces just spaffing money up the wall all the time. The lesson there isn't that we shouldn't fund the police. The lesson there is that we shouldn't be spending money on these particular projects. So it's really, really vital to make that distinction, that while there is some waste, that doesn't represent the whole. And fixing that waste allows us to redirect that money to things that really, I think almost everybody could agree are good things. I think, when you see people who've spent their lives disabled because of polio, something that we have eradicated in the developed world, but not in the developing world, to me, the bang for buck that we get in terms of spending an extra £10 on polio eradication compared to an extra £10 in the UK, whether it's on £10 of tax cuts or £10 of NHS spending or whatever, or university spending, which is probably the sort of thing that we'd be spending this money on instead. It's really hard for me to think that we'd be better off if we were spending, or the world would be better off if we were spending that money in the UK than in countries where polio still exists.
Duncan, do you think, the public generally agree with that? If they felt that their, taxpayers funded projects were actually being spent on vaccines and things like that, they would be, more receptive, that would be more popular. It's the perception that this money is being misspent that does the damage.
I think perceptions could well be changed if the focus was indeed more on, as Sam was alluding to, some of the vaccine work which differed in various organisations, which the ODA funding actually does for that. But as Sam correctly identifies, it's important that we do focus on these instances of waste. Now, I do concede that the dev tracker on DFID is fantastic. It's very comprehensive. It itemizes pretty much every project, be it a sort of standalone single year thing or over many billions over multiple years. To gauge sort of the exact value for money for that is difficult, but nevertheless the information provided has improved markedly over recent years. So that's a reasonable point. The slight difficulty, however, is that around about 2/3 of the aid which the UK gives is bilateral. So it's country to country, whereas the other third is through multilateral institutions. Now, obviously, a lot of the work that we do at the TPA is through freedom of information requests, so we can get a reasonable picture of spending, which generally happens sort of within the UK from public sector organisations. Now, when that is transferred to various UN bodies, World Health Organization, for example, that becomes very difficult to scrutinise a lot of the work. Now, again, I do concede that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater entirely, but nevertheless, that's multi-billions every year, which frankly we just don't really have an understanding of what's happening. So it's important to highlight where we do have access to that kind of information, like the ones that you raised in your report. I think we did a report last year, which I think we're still giving about £80 million to China. Generally in 2019-20, I think we sort of funded a mascot in Shanghai. I don't know why we did that, Emma, to be honest. But those instances are very, very important to highlight that. I think added to which, some of the breakdown of the spending as well. It's not purely a team of bureaucrats sitting in Whitehall offices in DFID. A lot of this is transferred across departments. So, for example, BEIS, the Business Innovation Department, they fund a lot of research councils, which then fund academic projects. I think the Newton Fund in particular, that was taken to task by the ICAI, which is again the regulation which Sam was alluding to, is particularly poor value for money, and that was only a very, very recent report. So the difficulty is that when it becomes more diffuse, a lot of the aid spending becomes more diffuse, be that through multilateral institutions or through increasing array of government departments, it then becomes more difficult to gauge this. So yes, indeed, it's entirely reasonable that the public perception of UK aid is quite negative at the moment, but frankly, we are still scratching the surface, and there's a lot that we don't know in terms of the misspending, which is almost certainly happening.
Yeah, that's an incredibly good point. And we'll say that the numbers I referred to a little earlier, they were foreign aid that was spent by the Department of Health, which was a lot more sort of lifestyle intervention rather than the DFID spending, which was a lot more, focused on reducing poverty, vaccines, that sort of thing. If we turn away from talking about specific levels of spending, should it be X percent? There's an argument from some quarters, and I think, Sam, you said you used to be an aid skeptic, and I wonder if this is why, that aid spending, encourages dependency, stifles innovation and growth in the countries that receive it. Is that where your skepticism came from? And if that was, why did you change your mind?
The answer is yes. I think there are loads of ways that aid spending, if not done in the right way, can do more harm than good, and we just shouldn't do it at all. I've never at all really believed the argument that it's not our duty or it's not our responsibility. I don't really think in those terms. I think about how can we make people's lives as good as possible, and if aid spending doesn't do that, if it's counterproductive, for example, by giving a government an incentive to impoverish its people because the government knows it will get more aid money and then it will siphon that money off, that's obviously a bad thing. But I think it's important to be clear that isn't really the kind of aid spending we do anymore. That used to be the kind of aid spending we did. And to be honest, when I was a really vocal aid critic, it was sort of at the point where we were transitioning away. There was this setting up DFID under Blair. There was a sort of transition away from the old kind of model of aid spending towards this more bottom-up, kind of more pragmatic model of aid spending. As Duncan says, we're not all the way there yet, and I think it's really, really vital that we highlight where aid is spent, where using things like economics, where aid spending can do no harm, like vaccinations for kids or mosquito nets, things like that. But empirically, that just isn't the kind of aid, for the most part, that we have now. And when we cut development aid, it is the sorts of things like polio eradication that we're cutting. When we cut development aid, we're not cutting these, supposed hydroelectric dams or these. I mean, a lot of the bilateral payments that I am kind of critical of are the ones that people who want to cut aid are in favor of, because there's this idea that aid money should be used to kind of boost our foreign policy, and that aid money should be a kind of, if it doesn't make a government like us, then it's a waste of money. As if vaccinating a child against polio isn't a reward in itself. And so my fear, so my fear is just that we're getting it exactly wrong. We're cutting the stuff that prevents kids from getting sick and dying. We're spending just as much on the stuff that is actually probably bad for the world, that kind of props up bad governments and things like that, because we have this sort of misguided idea that foreign policy can be enabled by aid spending. And what I would love would be for aid critics to differentiate between those and say we should be spending less on the latter and more on the former. We should be redirecting money away from kind of foreign policy type projects towards really basic health interventions. To me, that would be an amazingly good use of people's time and people's insights and people's kind of voices. Because ultimately, at the end of this, we're talking about kind of real children, real people who will die. And the current approach we're taking means we're eliminating the best aid and maintaining the least good aid, possibly actually bad aid.
All right, well, Sam's actually already answered my last question, which was going to be, is there a case for being more hard-nosed about the way we talk about aid, instead of making, the moral arguments and the feel-good examples, which, make us all feel happy? And should we think about it in terms of, okay, well, if we spend this money, it increases the economic security of a country, it makes it easier for, British countries to invest and export. You would say that no, we don't need to be more hard-nosed about it. We need to talk about saving lives and vaccines and malaria nets.
Totally. Although I would characterize my view as the hard-nosed view. I think that we should use economics. I think we should calculate how much it costs to save a life, and we should eliminate every program that doesn't meet that standard of value for money. And we should direct all of our resources into the most basic programs: deworming, malaria nets, cash transfers. Sometimes, surprisingly, can be really direct cash transfers to people rather than to governments, can be really effective. And we should ruthlessly eliminate any project that doesn't meet that kind of standard. And this is, I think, a really hard-nosed way of looking at it, because it basically says, yeah, we're going to treat lives like they're numbers in an accounting book. But unfortunately, that's the way we can do the most good with our money and with limited resources. And ultimately, I think that is what would kind of make people's lives as good as possible in these countries. But I think it's really misguided to think that aid can actually help us as a sort of foreign policy tool. I think it probably doesn't. The US spends enormous amounts of money on bilateral aid to countries that hate it and don't seem to be changing their views of it anytime soon. And secondly, in kind of thinking that it's somehow soft to want to prevent people from dying of preventable diseases. It's not soft. We're human beings. We have a sense of empathy for other human beings just as much as we do in other parts of the country. We have some degree of empathy and sympathy for people that we've never met in other countries, and that's just in our nature. So to me, that's the hard-nosed approach. And the sort of soft, soppy approach is the idea that, if we chuck £1 billion to the Pakistani government, they'll really like us eventually. They'll really do us some favors. That's the misguided, soft approach in my mind.
Duncan, what do you think in terms of what would be most efficient for the UK spending, but also, what would the public prefer to see their money spent on?
Yeah, I've got a lot of sympathy with that position. I think going for the soft power approach, sort of getting wrapped up in these sort of slightly tedious and undefinable jingoistic arguments of, as Sam says, let's give $1 billion to the Pakistanis and then they'll, do wonderful things for us. I mean, that's incredibly hard to evidence. And don't forget that. I mean, a lot of the aid industry. I mean, frankly, it's a bit of a self-serving racket. I mean, you have various foreign policy think tanks, Chatham House, for example, which churn out these various nebulous reports, which then they find very agreeable in the wider aid industry, and it's a very self-reinforcing closed industry. So necessarily, I mean, of course, a lot of the aid industry will be up in arms about the current position of the government towards this. So I think it's very, very important to try and separate the broader nebulous view of British foreign policy and how I think ineffective using aid can be to advance the British national interest, whatever that is, however that's defined. But I think sort of more fundamentally, I mean, the concern about, yes, as Sam alludes to, a lot of the work which aid spending is doing now, a lot of vaccination programs, be it COVID or otherwise. I think COVID spending in 2020 was in excess of £1 billion. I think principally through the COVAX scheme. More fundamentally, though, I think it's more proper that individuals should be determining how they want to be spending their own money on various charitable causes. As I alluded to, I think the UK's sort of individuals are some of the most charitable in the world. I think the level of charitable giving in the first half of 2020 was well in excess of the first 6 months of 2019. I think leaving a lot of these decisions, however noble they may seem, to, as I said, a self-serving aid industry, which is then buttressed by weak ministers in the UK, I don't think they should be determining the priorities of how people would like their tax is spent on various aid projects, that should be much more removed from various levers being pulled in Whitehall.
Great, thanks Duncan and Sam for joining me. Thanks for watching. Be sure to let us know in the YouTube comments whether either of our panelists today have managed to convince you to change your minds. And as always, there will be an IEA Twitter poll to find out what you think. You can follow us at IEA London on Twitter, IEA London on Facebook, and IEA UK on Instagram. And since you're already here, I hope you'll subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel if you haven't already. If you're interested in further supporting our digital work, you can sign up and support the IEA on Patreon, where we have a membership platform that allows our followers to donate solely towards our digital work and receiving exclusive access perks, benefits, and priority access to content, including this show. You can watch it 24 hours ahead of its release on YouTube. If you'd like the opportunity to help the IEA produce stimulating and educational content online, head over to patreon.com/IEA London or click the link in the show notes.